Alright, so hello everyone. So I'm Michael C. Jamilan. This is now the third part of our series of video lectures. So this is now the final part. And this is of course intended for you, students of Political History and Geopolitics of the world. Alright, so today we'll be talking about something that we have left off sa second part ng video lecture series natin. And we are of course talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the succeeding events or the succeeding occurrences that happened during the course of the Cold War or during the continuation of the so-called Cold War. At the time, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in the year 1949 hanggang sa occurrences ng mga series of proxy wars that took place in the middle in between 1949 hanggang sa matapos yung tinatawag nating Cold War following the dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1991. Alright, so as I said, we are of course going to talk about the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is an organization, an international organization, a military alliance that you are all familiar with. Lalong-lalo na if you are following the events or you are following or up to date doon sa news regarding the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict wherein not only do Ukraine and Russia are involved but also meron tayong engagement din ng mga iba pang mga bansa, mostly mga Western powers, particularly that of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One of the reasons why, of course, yung expansion nito, one of the reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine in the first place. Alright, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as I was saying kanina, this is an intergovernmental military alliance. So strictly, this is a military alliance with member states coming from the North Atlantic region. We have 28 European countries as well as 2 North American countries, and strictly they are located within the so-called North Atlantic, yung sa hilagang bahagi ng Atlantic Ocean. So the NATO was established in the aftermath, so following the consummation or nung natapos na yung Second World War. So the organization implements of course the so-called North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed noong April 4, 1949. Right, so now as I was saying kanina, this is a military alliance. Why? Mostly because NATO constitutes a system of collective security. So when we say collective security, parang they act as one in defense of a state that is invaded by another state, say for example, a non-NATO member. So collective security, the member states of the NATO would then pool their resources, mostly mga armaments, mga military vehicles, in order to help that state or that member state that is in need of their help, hence the concept of collective security. Now, aside from that, its independent member states, of course, sa NATO agree to mutual defense. So, in relation na rin sa collective security, in response to an attack, say for example, by an external party, just like in the case of Russia, which invaded Ukraine. But it's a complicated story, being that Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but is trying to become a member since its dissolution, yung dissolution ng Soviet Union noong 1991. So matagal-tagal nang nag-a-apply ang Ukraine for membership sa NATO. But the fact that NATO did help Ukraine when Russia invaded this country a month ago, more than a month ago, entails a lot of complicated backstory to begin with para ma-understand natin kung bakit ganun ang nangyayari. But if you're going to summarize that, we can say that even though Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, its allies, okay? So yung mga member states nito, the Eastern European countries, Western, and yung 28 European countries, still they are ideologically allied with Ukraine. And so inciting this specific article sa NATO Charter, which basically states na if a NATO ally is being invaded by an external party, then it would mean that NATO would, of course, intervene or would help that non-NATO member, which is in the case now is Ukraine. Alright, so one thing to remember about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is that it was established during the Cold War. So the year was 1949 and the Cold War happened in 1945, if you remember, when Harry S. Truman, through a speech, issued its Truman Doctrine, which basically states yung policy or advances the policy of containment na tinatawag. So the NATO was established in response to the threat, of course, posed by the Soviet Union. So everything has to do with the threat posed by the Soviet Union, particularly na yung fears na baka mag-spread ang communism to the neighboring states or countries ng the old Soviet Union. Now, it is for this very reason din, since purely ang rason kung bakit ang lahat ng mga ito ay naitatag simply because of the Soviet Union, yung expansion or enlargement ng NATO has led now to tensions with non-member Russia. Okay? With Russian President Vladimir Putin demanding that NATO provide legal guarantees that it would stop expanding east to countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So I think a week or several weeks before the invasion of Ukraine took place, parang nag-issue si Vladimir Putin ng parang kanyang tatlong points, tatlong perspektibo during a meeting that took place somewhere in Europe. So he issued his 3 demands, and one of those demands is that NATO would stop expanding eastward sa Eastern Europe, doon sa mga states that border Ukraine sa may bandang west na tinatawag yun nga. So Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, it so happened that these are the 3 remaining bordering countries na hindi pa member ng NATO, but they are applying to become member of NATO, and it's for this very reason that Russia is supplying arms and funding yung resistant movements ng mga separatist regions or resistance groups within Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Alright, so yun. So it's a very complicated story, and for us to better understand the whole of NATO, or at least mas maintindihan natin mabuti aside from the definition and the discussion that I already provided for you, let us now watch this 3 minutes and 30 seconds video.
What is NATO, and why are the world's most powerful leaders suddenly so worried about it? Well, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a political and military alliance between North America and Europe that was born out of World War II and signed into effect in 1949. Its main aim back then, to push back against any future aggression from the Soviet Union.
The developments of the North Atlantic Pact may have been reflected in the recent changes in the Soviet High Command.
This became particularly important in 1955 when the Soviet Union and 7 other European countries signed the Warsaw Pact. Communism was spreading across Eastern and Central Europe, and this pact promised military support for Soviet satellite states. There were 12 original NATO member countries. Today, there are 28. 7 of those are former Warsaw Pact countries. Each member of NATO has an equal say in discussions and decisions. One of the most important principles of the NATO treaty is Article 5. It states that an attack on one country is in theory an attack against all members. In theory, all troops and equipment in each nation is available for NATO to use. That means there are 3.6 million active personnel and another 3.7 million in reserve. So if it really came down to it, 7.3 million NATO forces could be mobilized. But Article 5 has been invoked only once in its nearly 70-year history, the day after 9/11. It led to NATO action in Afghanistan. Collectively, NATO member states account for most of the globe's military spending, just under $1 trillion. In 2006, all 28 member states agreed to spend 2% of their GDP for the alliance's defense spending. But in fact, in reality, that target is rarely met. In 2015, the median spend was just 1.18%. The United States spent a whopping 3.7%. That means that America accounted for some 70% of the alliance's total defense spending, and it is only one of 5 countries to spend more than 2%. NATO admits the funding imbalance has been an issue since the start of the alliance and that it does cause friction. During his presidential election campaign, Donald Trump threatened to pull out of the treaty, calling it, quote, obsolete. He also said the U.S. would only help countries that paid their fair share.
Because we're protecting these countries. We have the seal of the United States in these countries.
A major test of Trump's tough stance could come in 2017 when U.S. troops are due to be deployed in Eastern Europe under Washington's European Reassurance Initiative. The U.S. had gradually withdrawn its military presence from Europe since the fall of the Soviet Union. But that all changed in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea and started conducting military operations in eastern Ukraine. The U.S. responded with a $1 billion emergency response. Next year, that budget is set to triple to $3.4 billion. But will President-elect Trump follow through? We'll have to wait and see. Phil Hahn, CNBC, London.
Still watching? Perfect. Click here to watch another great video from CNBC International. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.
Alright, so thank you for paying attention to that video. So I hope that that had already provided more answers sa inyo and more additional details dun sa explanation ko kanina. Alright, so let's move on then with the next slide here. Alright, so this map represents, of course, the expansion of NATO in case hindi pa malinaw sa inyo yung nasabi ko sa inyo kanina. So, of course, we have 28 member countries of 28 plus 2, so we have 28 European countries, and then we have 2 North American countries that form part this so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Alright, so at the time it was founded in the year 1949, during the 1940s, meron tayong mga original members dito from Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, United Kingdom, and then the United States. And then during the 1950s, 1950s, particularly 1952, with Greece and Turkey becoming the additional members of the founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it so happened that's very interesting that we have these 2 countries, Greece and Turkey, kasi if you remember what I told you about the Truman Doctrine, particularly that of the containment policy na issued by Harry S. Truman, in the late 1940s, he basically issued the Truman Doctrine in response doon sa invasion ng Soviet Union sa Iran at the time. And then Iran, of course, borders the countries of Greece and Turkey. Alright, so in response to that, parang there is this fear na baka Greece and Turkey might fall doon sa hands of communism, started of course by the Soviet Union, and then baka it will become the next target of Soviet Union in its invasion. The United States basically supplied, they funded sort of like yung Greece and Turkey, and yun yung reason for that. So yun yung kaya ako na-remember itong dalawang bansa na ito. And then in 1955, so we had now the Federal Republic of Germany. So this is like the West Germany, yung western section ng Germany. So subdivided kasi ang Germany during that time. And then during the 1980s, of course, nag-expand ang NATO to include now Spain. And then during the 1990s, we now have the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And for the 2000s or 2004 onwards, we now have itong mga several former Soviet Union member countries, such as for example, Slovakia becoming member now of NATO. So aside from that, we also have the rest of the Eastern European countries, yung Baltic states na tinatawag, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then we have Slovenia and then Romania. So basically napapalibutan na ang Russia, and that now incited fears. And the Russian Federation became threatened now with this NATO expansion na tinatawag. And then hindi pa natapos dyan kasi by 2009, 2 additional countries became members of NATO, such as Albania and Croatia now. And then by 2017, 1 additional member was integrated doon sa entirety ng North Atlantic Treaty Organization with the brand new country of Montenegro. And by 2020s, specifically 2 years ago, we now have North Macedonia becoming the newest member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So yun yung decades-long expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then aside from this usual member states, meron din tayong mga bansa na sort of like indirectly linked to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, such as yung mga nakulayan dyan, yung mga traditional partners ng Europe and the West, the United States, such as New Zealand, Australia, Japan. So all of these are the allies of the so-called NATO, and they are also the ones who are now helping the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians sa ongoing na Ukraine-Russia conflict. Right? Okay, just in case hindi pa rin malinaw sa inyo yung discussion natin, let me present this interactive map wherein it will be presented sa inyo yung expansion ng NATO from the 1940s, specifically 1949 up to 2020s. Alright, basically that's the expansion, interactive na mapa na present ko sa inyo regarding sa expansion ng NATO. Okay, let's now proceed with the next slide. Alright, so same thing lang din, another interactive map. Okay, so you can see there the expansion of NATO, and of course itong NATO expansion na ito that now caused Russia to be threatened, Kasi parang it's like NATO saying na we are surrounding you, or nakapalibot kami sa inyo, so there's no way for you there's no way out for you. Okay? Kasi halos lahat ng mga strategic na mga bansa, kung mapapansin natin, yung mga bansa na may mga mountain ranges that would serve as a barrier for the supposedly mga Western powers to not conquer Russia ay kasali na sa NATO, including yung mga bansa katulad ng Turkey and Greece na that borders the Black Sea, and then of course the Mediterranean Sea. And if that would have been controlled by the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, it would have been beneficial for them. Alright, so another interactive map. So marami tayong mapa dito. Alright. Alright, so let us now proceed to other events that also took place during the course of the Cold War. So yeah, so makikita natin dito yung mushroom clouds, and then of course yung sinisignify na mga mushroom clouds na to, basically kapag meron tayong expansive, extensive, powerful explosion emanating from the land. So this is now the aerial view of that mushroom cloud, and of course you're familiar with that because that took place yun nga, right after the Second World War, with of course the dropping of these twin bombs over the twin cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sa bansang Japan noong World War II. And that basically ended the Second World War because of what would be the response of the Axis powers to that, kasi they have wala naman silang equivalent na instrument or tool to like equal that what the Allied forces or the United States had achieved. Alright, so anyway, prior to the, of course, bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, parang, di ba, like I told you doon sa past video natin, traditional allies itong Soviet Union and the United States during the Second World War, parang magkakampi sila. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that one is ideologically communist and the other is capitalist. Okay, so it's bound to happen na magkakaroon ng conflict. So there's a mutual distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States. Much more so noong nakita ng Soviet Union itong nangyari sa pagbomba sa Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So parang that now had parang it made the feeling of distrust sa Russia, sa Soviet Union grew. Okay, parang mas naging prominent na ngayon yung distrust na nararamdaman ng USSR sa United States. Okay, kaya nagkaroon na tayo ngayon ng tinatawag nating US-Soviet arms race. So parang wala na itong alliance na to. Kung meron man, meron tayong continuous atmosphere na parang they are mutually distrusting one another and they are threatened of each other. So what is all about the so-called US-Soviet arms race? So of course, an arms race, it's a competition concerning the production of weapons, the growth of a military, and the aim of superior military technology. Okay, so yung building ng tanks, military tanks, okay, yung mga advanced na mga military techs or technology. Okay, so they had a competition about who can produce the better weapon of mass destruction, so to speak. Now, the arms race is also used to describe any long-term escalating competitive situation. So this is more appropriate to use to describe the US-Soviet arms race, where each competitor, this time so we have the Soviet Union and the United States, focuses on outdoing others by producing better, bigger, more effective weapons of, ayun sinabi ko sa inyo kanina, mass destruction. And then following the arms race between these two competitive countries, we also had the US-Soviet space race. So parang they had parang kinonduct nila yung competition out of land and patungo sa outer space. And so nangyari yung tinatawag nating space race between these two countries. So in space race, of course, again, it's a Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to develop aerospace capabilities. Okay, so building rockets, missiles. Okay, who's going to go to the atmosphere first, who's going to land on the moon first. Okay, basically it's that. Alright, so aside from developing and building aerospace capabilities, the space race is also about doing or building artificial satellites, unmanned space probes, and human space flight. So remember that the Soviets were the first one, of course, to go into space. So remember, if you still remember, Yuri Gagarin, the first one to go into space. So the Soviet Union beat the United States for that matter. And then the Soviet Union also was the first one to have the first woman to go into space in the person of Valentina Tereshkova something. So they achieved a series of firsts And then of course, hindi naman magpapatalo ang United States kasi of course, they do not want to be outdone. They also had the series of Apollo missions with, I'm not sure kung Apollo 11, 12, or 13 yung nakapagpadala ng manned mission sa buwan or sa moon. And they had done of course yung first ever moon landing na tinatawag in the person of Neil Armstrong, if you are familiar of him. Okay, so basically, yun yung arms race, and then yung counterpart niya sa outer space, we have the so-called space race naman. Alright, so if you're familiar with this picture, this one depicts another proxy war, another proxy war that took place during the course of the so-called Cold War. So this one naman, di ba, as we all know, kapag sinabi nating proxy war kasi, it's a kind of war wherein merong active military engagement itong mga resistant movements within this specific country, but it's only for the very reason na may mga nagsusupport sa kanila ng mga more powerful countries, okay, who are mutually distrusting one another, are fearful of one another, okay, so they had a war na involved sila, but they are not actively involved in that war, kaya tinatawag nating proxy war, if that makes sense. Alright, so the proxy war, one of these proxy wars is the so-called the Korean War. So remember kasi, di ba, noong 1910s, the Chinese government annexed the Korean Peninsula. So parang meron tayong single Korea during that time. Pero I think following the Second World War, nung natapos na ang World War II, we had the Soviet Union now controlling the sector of North Korea. So parang they are the ones now who is governing that specific portion of Korea. So much bigger ang North Korea nung panahon na from 1910s to the 1950s. And then of course yung southern portion ng Korean Peninsula was of course governed, manned, or supervised by the United States. Yung North Korea, aside from the Soviet Union supporting that country, we also had this communist countries such as China is also funding or supervising or governing that specific Korea. So meron tayong like border between these two Koreas, the so-called 38th parallel. Okay, so yung 38 parallel pala siyang border lines with military fencing and active military troops that supervises and mans that specific border. So parang it's one of the strictest border control in the world even during that time, and of course up to now. So the Soviet Union and the United States installed that 38 parallel in order to divide the two Koreas during the time. Now, yung itong proxy war, itong Korean War, nangyari noong sinuportahan na ng Soviet Union ang North Korea by, giving them arms, by funding their militaries, the resistant movements, and also ang United States, they also did the same thing. The United Nations engaged themselves, specifically the United States, also did the same thing sa South Korea. And so, yung Korean War nangyari na nga during that time, and that specific war took place from 1950 to 1953 for a period of 3 years. So there's a lot of casualties and deaths, of course, that occurred. Pero mas marami yung mga namatay sa parte ng North Korea. And then of course, South Korea, being that they are more military capable than the North, because of course they are supported by the West, somehow sort of like they won. But of course, sa any klase ng war naman, nobody wins. Alright, so this is once again an interactive map. So yung red dyan represents of course North Korea, and then yung green dyan represents South Korea. So tignan niyo yung expansion niya. So yung 38 parallel, it's in the middle of the two Koreas. So from 1950 up to 1951, patuloy na nagbabago yung borders. Okay, the borders are do constantly change during the course of that year hanggang sa magkaroon na tayo ngayon ng present na border between these two, formal official borders between these two Koreas. Will there be a chance of reunification between the two? All right, we'll never know. Pero knowing na ang North Korea, ang North Korea it's called as the Democratic Socialist Republic of Korea. So it's very ironic that they formally named their country as Democratic Republic of Korea when in fact it's the opposite. They are not democratic in the first place. So parang the founding father of the North Korea is yung grandfather ng present na premier ng North Korea na si Kim Jong-un. So yung grandfather niya si Kim Il-sung, who is regarded as the founding father of North Korea. And then yung South Korea at that time din parang ang pinaka leader during that time when the United States or the United Nations supported South Korea, so they had instituted a certain Syngman Rhee to lead South Korea at that time. Alright, so ito yung phases ng Korean War. Okay, so just like what I told you kanina, I hope malinaw yung pagkaka-explain natin kanina. So from 1950 to 1951 to 1952 hanggang sa 1953 with the formal installation or establishment of the so-called DMZ, the 38th parallel noong 1950s, but it's now more known as the so-called demilitarized zone or the DMZ. Alright, so ito yung 38th parallel. Okay, so as like what I told you kanina, it's the strictest border control with the strictest checkpoint. Nobody is allowed to go into North Korea and vice versa. Of course, if you want to get killed instantly by landmines at iba pang mga military defenses that were installed, okay? So a series kasi yan ng mga military defenses, like merong mga tunnels, merong mga obstacles na tinatawag aside from those snipers na makikita along the way, na hiding in plain sight or hiding in so that's basically the DMZ or the demilitarized zone. Alright, so this is a picture, actual picture of the militarized zone. Okay, so yung blue house dyan, of course, that's the facility that you can go into kapag gusto mong, if you want to have talks with North Korea, particularly with their leader. So a series of US presidents held their meetings or talks there with whomever is the eternal leader of North Korea during that time. So one of the most notable leaders that visited this Blue House is Donald Trump. When he visited North Korea 2018, 2019, 2020 yata yan. So, of course, he met with the leader of North Korea at that time, which was Kim Jong-un. So, hopefully, makipag-usap sana sila sa Singapore, pero the meeting took place instead sa may bahagi ng DMZ or demilitarized zone, pero nothing good happened out of that meeting kasi patuloy pa rin naman yung engagement or parang patuloy na pagproduce ng nuclear weapons and pagpaparada ng mga nuclear capabilities ang North Korea. It's a very small country but they have very ambitious leader and they have very grand ambitions, so to speak, to make up for the smallness of their country na tinatawag. And if you want to be more familiar with the DMZ, you might want, if you're familiar with this crash landing on you, then basically you might want to check that out. So it's a story of a Korean woman who accidentally landed sa North Korea because of an accident, na yung parachute niya accidentally landed sa may bahagi ng North Korea, and of course he met this North Korean soldier. Alright, so this is Crash Landing on You, of course, with the lead star there who seemed to be familiar. Kamukha ko. Joke lang. Baka may magalit. Alright, so aside from the Korean War, we now have this. So, ito naman yung counterpart ng North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, this is now what we call as the so-called Warsaw Pact. So, this is the logo or the symbol of the Warsaw Pact. So, Warsaw Pact being that it was held, or it was the meeting that na kung saan nangyari itong agreement or pact na ito took place, of course, in Warsaw, in Poland. Alright, so the Warsaw Pact was established in 1955. So several years after naman the establishment or the foundation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So just like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact is also a military alliance. But this time, it's a military alliance of communist countries. So it relied on the theory of collective security, just like yung mga members ng NATO, na ganun din yung stipulation nila, ganun din yung sinasabi nila dito. But for the Warsaw Pact, if one Warsaw Pact member state is attacked or was attacked, the other member states would also help in defending that attacked member state. So same principle, just like with NATO. Alright, so yung red dyan represents yung mga bansa na kasali sa Warsaw Pact. So we have Russia, the Soviet Union, Poland, okay, Georgia, Moldova, and several countries na makikita sa Eastern Europe. So those are the members of the Warsaw Pact. So for 36 years, NATO and the Warsaw Pact never directly waged war against each other in Europe. So pero the case is that the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies implemented strategic policies aimed at the containment of each other in Europe. So while working and fighting for influence within the wider Cold War on the international stage. So itong mga 5 things na ito that took place during the course of the Cold War. So yung isa na discuss na natin kanina, the Korean War. We also have other proxy wars that took place after the Korean War. For example, we have the Vietnam War. We have the Bay of Pigs invasion. We have the Dirty War, the Cambodian-Vietnamese wars, and other series of proxy wars. Alright, so we have to emphasize here na basically the Warsaw Pact have the same aims, just like with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Alright, of course, we also have to go back na to Germany, specifically yung subdivision ng Germany into West and East Germany. So, aside from that, within East Germany, doon kasi matatagpuan yung capital ng Germany. Okay? We have Berlin. The capital of West Germany at that time ay Bonn, B-O-N-N. Pero in the case of East Germany, Berlin is the capital of that. And even today, capital ng Germany ang Berlin. Pero ang Berlin per se, just like what I discussed in the previous video, is also subdivided into 2 different sectors. Okay? The eastern sector is controlled by the Soviet Union, and then the western sector is basically controlled by the West. Particularly the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. Now, during the time of Nikita Khrushchev, who replaced the leader who came after Joseph Stalin, is that Malenkov or something? Pero Nikita Khrushchev was the one who ordered the Berlin Wall to be built to separate Berlin into 2 Berlins, the East Berlin and then the West Berlin. So he thought of Why not physically subdividing the two Berlins into two via building this physical structure called the Berlin Wall? So yung tinatawag nating Berlin Wall, okay, it's a guarded concrete barrier. So guarded siya because you have militaries there, okay, by both the east and the western sectors. Concrete barrier. So concrete being that it is made out of huge bricks, thick bricks, that physically and at the same time ideologically divided Berlin. So from the period of 1961 to 1989. So when we say ideologically, Eastern, of course, is communist, okay, East Germany, and West Germany, of course, is democratic, being controlled by the United Nations, particularly that of the three countries that I mentioned earlier. Alright, so yung entirety ng West Berlin ay napalibutan ng Berlin Wall. It was constructed in the year 1961, of course, with the participation of both the West and East Germans. Okay, so 1961, nagsimulang i-construct yan. Okay, at nagtagal yan, of course, noong 1989. Pero yung full development, nung na ipatayo na in full ang Berlin Wall, makikita natin dyan yung series of obstacles. So parang we have this physical barrier or physical wall or fence, and then in the middle of that, meron tayong parang tinatawag yan na parang death trap or death portion of the wall na merong mga naka-install dyan ng mga landmines and other explosive na mga materials na just in case you had jumped over the fence. Okay? Specifically for the East Germans who had defected into West Germany, before ka makatakas sa East Germany, you have to climb over the fence, pero before that, you have to, yung maneuver yourself or manage yourself out of the landmines that took place there. Tapos meron pa tayong mga barbed wire, fencing, to deter the defectors coming from East Germany na tinatawag. Okay? So it's a very colorful wall, okay, but also very deadly because a lot of deaths occurred in that Berlin Wall. So noong 1989 nga, nagkaroon na tayo ngayon ng collapse ng Berlin Wall, physical collapse ng Berlin Wall, with of course ang US President at the time na ay si Ronald Reagan, who is famous for his statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, kasi the leader of the Soviet Union at the time is already ang pangalan niya? That's Mikhail Gorbachev. Alright, so ito na ngayon yung present na Berlin Wall. So, of course, majority ng sections ng Berlin Wall have already been fallen down. So, natumba na siya, nasira na siya, sinira siya intentionally. Pero itong remaining na mga kwan, so they are kept as, memorial to the times to the times of the Cold War. So itong wall na ngayon na to na remained intact, this is now of course the relic border between separating East Germany to West Germany. So relic border na siya because the so-called border no longer exists, but the physical structure that did divide East from West Germany still remains. Kaya siya tinawag na relic border. Alright, so aside from the building of the Berlin Wall, meron din tayong Bay of Pigs invasion. So that took place naman na during the term of John F. Kennedy as the US President. So basically, the Bay of Pigs invasion, it's a failed siya kasi it became unsuccessful, okay, to the disgrace of John F. Kennedy. It's a failed landing operation on the southwestern coast of Cuba. So here, ayan yung Bay of Pigs. by Cuban exiles who opposed Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. So parang Fidel Castro was this charismatic leader. Okay, parang he is one of the symbols of the communist world, or he was one of the faces of the communist world during that time. So itong Bay of Pigs invasion, it was covertly financed and directed by the US government with of course, the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency or the CIA with the help of this supposedly makakatulong sana sa United States, the so-called Cuban exiles. So the operation basically took place at the height of the Cold War, as I was saying. And yung failure ng invasion na ito sa Bay of Pigs sa Cuba led of course to major shifts o yung pagbabago ngayon sa conduct or relationships between specifically Cuba, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Kaya hanggang sa ngayon, on unfriendly terms pa rin ang Cuba and the United States, and of course Soviet Union and the United States, or Russia and the United States, pero friendly ang Cuba with the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union back then. And then of course that did not change. Yung relationship ng US and Cuba did not change for a period of decades. So it took some time before na malift yung embargo, I mean yung pagbabawal for Cuba to import and export their goods. So that hindered their economic development. Pero that changed ultimately when a succession of presidents led by Barack Obama ultimately changed yung policy, foreign policy specifically ng United States toward Cuba. Pero as of the moment, ganun pa rin, still there's a feeling of mutual distrust between Cuba and the United States, of course, following yung Bay of Pigs invasion, and of course yung yung history nila together na of course characterized as being unfriendly. Alright, so that's the failed invasion led by these exiles na tinatawag, who are opposing yung leadership ni Fidel Castro regarding sa Cuban Revolution na initiate niya or sinagawa niya to overthrow the leadership of this US supported or US sponsored or installed leader of Cuba na si Fulgencio Batista. So through the Cuban Revolution, of course, Fidel Castro, led by this guy, yung the one who's raising his hand. And then of course, yung si Che Guevara, who is another face of the communist world. And then I think yung kapatid ni Fidel Castro na si Raul Castro was also the leader of Cuba nung namatay si Fidel Castro. So as of the moment, communist pa rin sila. So that's all about the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion. Alright, so following naman yung Bay of Pigs invasion, of course, may involvement pa rin ang Soviet Union, so hindi mawawala yan. So this is another one of the so-called proxy conflicts or proxy wars, and this one, Cuban Missile Crisis, could have been a full-scale or full-blown war had it not for the series of negotiations that took place between the leaderships ng United States and Soviet Union at that time. Alright, so what's all about the Cuban Missile Crisis? So from the name Missile Crisis, so it involves of course yung deployment, storage, at saka yung anything that has to do with nuclear missiles. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is this 1 month, almost a month or over a month na confrontation, active military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that escalated into an international crisis. The reason being that yung America, of course, led by John F. Kennedy during that time, deployed nuclear missiles and warheads sa may bahagi ng Italy and Turkey, which were fearful back then. So itong Turkey and Greece were fearful back then na baka they will be invaded by the Soviet Union. Of course, following yung invasion ng Soviet Union sa may bahagi ng Iran, and Iran, neighbors or borders almost itong Turkey and Greece. Alright, so following yung domino theory na kung saan kapag ang isang state ay communist and then yung neighboring states niya would fall into the communist hands as well. And that is the reason for the intervention then now of the United States Kaya nag-deploy sila ng missiles sa Italy and Turkey and even Greece. But of course, not to be outdone, the Soviet Union naman, the USSR, deployed similar ballistic missiles or nuclear warheads din sa may bahagi ng Cuba, and Cuba was in the Caribbean Sea, which is very near sa United States. So itong Cuban Missile Crisis during the time of John F. Kennedy remains up to this moment a defining moment sa US national security and yung nuclear war preparation, okay, ng United States. So this one had catapulted them or led them to really prepare for nuclear war just in case, you know, an emerging power in the case of the Soviet Union or as of the moment, the Russian Federation would, you know, trigger this missile crisis or nuclear crisis na tinatawag. Now, itong Cuban Missile Crisis, just like highlighted this slide natin, this confrontation is often considered as the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. And like what I told you earlier, had it not for the negotiations that took place between the US President John F. Kennedy at saka yung premier ng Soviet Union na si Nikita Khrushchev, so they had a series of talks and meetups. And they both agreed, following yung consummation ng talks nila, they both agreed na they will now be mindful doon sa ginagawa nilang pag-store at pag-deploy ng nuclear warheads, and they will each act as a police toward, for, and against each other para matignan, kumbaga, kung okay pa rin ba or nag-store pa rin ba or something like they na-destroy na ba yung nuclear missiles or whatever meron sila. Right, so that's all about the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's John F. Kennedy sa left, and then you have Fidel Castro there, and then the leader of the Soviet Union, which is Nikita Khrushchev. Alright, so after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so there are still a series of events, pero masasabi natin insignificant na. Alright, kasi following yung Cuban Missile Crisis, several decades or several years after that, medyo umokay naman na yung situation kasi nagkaroon na ng agreement itong Soviet Union and the United States, or the primary participants sa Cold War, and then of course yung series of agreements then called SALT, which was signed by the president after Kennedy, okay, and then the premier after Nikita Khrushchev. And so by then nag-end yung so-called Cold War noong 1991, okay, noong nag-fall na ang Berlin Wall noong 1989, and then noong na-dissolve na ang Soviet Union with the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Alright, but before that, of course, we have this this is one of the photos na ginagamit sa photojournalism, and this one is titled The Tank Man. Kasi you have a man there who is oblivious doon sa mga military tanks before him. Okay, so this photo was taken in China in the year 1989, which is the same year that the Berlin Wall had fallen down. Okay, so this tank man tinatawag, this so-called procession of military tanks took place in Beijing, doon sa specifically sa Tiananmen Square or sa Forbidden Palace somewhere in Beijing. Alright, so nagkaroon ng pro-democratic demonstrations ang mga Chinese students during that time kasi against very much sila doon sa cultural revolution na inano ni Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong yata. Okay, kasi of course the military was very enraged dyan sa pro-democratic demonstrations na iyan. Kasi makikita natin sa mga series of pictures sa susunod, the students were either run over by tanks or gunned down by the Chinese military. And then of course, makikita natin dito the demonstrators had suffered wounds, okay, because of being shot down or run over by military tanks. So that's 1989 sa Tiananmen Square na tinatawag. natin. And this is of course the collapse or the fall of the so-called Berlin Wall. Okay, na-explain natin yan kanina. And then, okay, so 1991 na, dito na yung official collapse naman ng the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So you have these two presidents here, okay, representing the United States. So you have George Herbert Walker Bush, and then representing the Soviet Union, that is Mikhail Gorbachev. Following yung adoption years prior, the collapse of the Soviet Union ng kanyang policy of perestroika or restructuring of the Soviet Union economy in favor of some capitalist policies. And then yung adoption din ng glasnost o yung openness naman ng Soviet Union toward yung capitalist market na tinatawag. So that had become very unpopular sa Soviet Union, but also adopted over time ng mga sumunod na mga leaders ng Soviet Union, which now became the Russian Federation, with of course Vladimir Putin, okay, as the leader. So makikita natin sa susunod na picture. So you have Bill Clinton, who replaced George Herbert Walker Bush, and then you have Vladimir Putin, who replaced the first president under sa bagong Russian Federation when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Alright, so that's the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. That's George W. Bush, with of course again Vladimir Putin. And then that's Barack Obama, Democrat, okay, who replaced George W. Bush. And then we have Vladimir Putin, the eternal president of Russia. And then another Republican, okay, so that's of course Donald Trump, who is so notorious for being so pro-Russian to the point na on public TV, on live TV, he praised Putin and he praised Russia, signifying his pro-Russian stance. And then sa mga interviews niya after the, during or in the midst of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, he's actually praising Putin. While Joseph Biden is very all-out dun sa suporta naman niya sa NATO and sa, sa Ukraine. And then Joseph Biden, as I was saying, and then of course Vladimir Putin. So yun yung tinatawag natin daw na New Cold War. Okay, so meron bang bagong Cold War na nangyayari? So that's the question now. Alright, so when we say Cold War pala, okay, anyway, this is a series of pictures then on the Chinese side. So George H.W. Bush with Mao Zedong, and then I will just put the name of that Chinese leader, but that's of course Bill Clinton. And then another Chinese leader with George W. Bush. And then another Chinese leader with George W. Bush. And then Barack Obama and Hu Jintao. And then Barack Obama and of course the present and the current leader of the Chinese Communist Party. So you have Xi Jinping, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And then of course, Joseph Biden or Joe Biden with Xi Jinping pa rin, who seem to not age. Alright, so what is all about the New Cold War? So ano namang tungkol dito? So the New Cold War, it's this heightened political, social, ideological, informational, and military tensions sa 21st century, referring to this time period right now between the United States and China. So when we say the New Cold War, it's actually these tensions in between the United States and China. But the New Cold War can also be used to describe yung tensions din that are currently occurring between the United States and Russia. Of course, emphasize yan during the Ukraine-Russia conflict na tinatawag. So Russia is the primary successor state, of course, ng former Soviet Union. So yun yung New Cold War. So it's either in between the US and China or the US and Russia. Pero more or less, the New Cold War is all about these tensions between the United States and China. Now, if it's not the New Cold War, how then should we call it? Right? Does it beg the question, is it a matter of cold peace? Bas kung meron tayong Cold War of course, this war of threats and mutual distrust and proxy wars. And then meron tayong Hot War na meron tayong active na military engagement and active military fighting between these two states na tinatawag. So that's Hot War. So Cold War, proxy wars. Pero is it a matter of cold peace? And what do we mean when we say cold peace? So cold peace, it's a state of relative peace kasi peace being a subjective term, depende yan sa sitwasyon. Cold peace between two countries that is marked by the enforcement of peace treaty, ending the state of war. So meron munang war na nangyari and then we had now this peace treaty. And then of course, habang may peace treaty in between these two countries, for example, the government of one state or one of the parties, or at least the populace of one of the parties to the treaty continues to treat the treaty with vocal disgust domestically. So parang the government either still dislikes or does not want to be linked with that state, or the population of that specific country still is distrustful or are not at peace with that so-called state. So yun yung cold peace na tinatawag, na parang cold shoulders kumbaga. Parang if somebody had given you the cold shoulders, parang iniiwan ka in peace, but then you get this feeling na parang he is mocking you, he is not supporting you, and something like that. So that's the feeling. So that's cold peace. Or if it's not a cold peace, is it a matter of hot peace? Then, pag sinabi naman natin hot peace, ito yung opposite ng cold peace. Hot peace is where political situation, where tensions, either informational, military, social, political, economic tensions between two countries are real. Nangyayari yan. But regardless of the tensions, regardless of the presence or the existence of these tensions, it will still lead unlikely to war. So walang war na mangyayari despite the tensions. So that's hot peace. So which is better? Cold peace or hot peace? Or should we describe the existence of this so-called new Cold War as more or like a cold peace or more or like hot peace? So that will now form part your learning activity number 6, wherein you have to answer those questions that I've just stated dito. And then another question that is very hot nowadays. Will there be World War III? That's the question na ayaw nating sagutin. This is like the type of question na ayaw nating mangyari in the current situation sa panahon natin, kasi marami na tayong problema na kinakaharap, climate change and all that, and then there comes pa this war, along with the pandemic. Alright, pero will there be World War III, or is there already a Third World War? Which is, in the first place now, kung meron man na mangyayaring World War III, it will be a nuclear war. According to political scientists and scholars, ang sabi nila, we are already in the middle of World War III, whether we have fully grasped it or not. This is according kay Ifugao, who is an expert on Russia and advisor for several Republican and Democratic US administrations. So this statement by Hill is also supported by a statement of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who stated na we are also in the middle of a World War III, whether we like it or not. So the question, will there be World War III? Yes. Is there World War III? Yes, according to these people, at least. So we end our discussion with this foreboding or parang sense of dread na, is it the end already? The end na ba? Hopefully it's not, because I'm referring to the end of our discussion, and hopefully we pray it's not the end of the world, only our discussion. So thank you so much for listening. Bye.